2012 area to light is Geoff Stray. There is no question about this, and particularly in Britain. Geoff is somebody that's been known to me for a very, very long time, and I can remember Geoff having a very early version of what would become his book, Beyond 2012. For years, it was like a sort of little folder of stuff that he would bring along to various lectures and meetings, and we'd have a chat in the pub about it. That's gone on to become the website, Diagnosis 2012, hugely influential around the world, and Geoff is now respected globally as one of the key scholars, if you wish, on the whole business of 2012. So it's a great pleasure to welcome him back with us, and I hope you're going to give a massive round of applause to Geoff Stray.
Hello. Hello. Good. You can hear me, all right? The advertised talk was going to be about the 9 gods and what the meaning is behind that, because this here is the latest picture of part of a monument that mentions 2012, and it's the only monument throughout of the whole of Mesoamerica that is known about, which actually mentions the end date in 2012. That original talk was really a 3-hour talk which would be compressed into 1 hour. But just very recently, some new information has come to light, so I have to give you an update, which takes quite a long time. So the 3-hour talk is now compressed into about 20 minutes. So I've tried to really take out most of it and just leave the juicy bits. But yeah, if you want to know more, throughout the talk there's a link to an article I've done on Graham Hancock's website. It's called the Tortuguero Prophecy Unraveled, and that will tell you in much more detail and more lucidly. Will cover this, but you have to still take the update into account when you read that essay, which was put up in March. Okay, so this is the title of the first part: Desperate Scholars and Renegades. This is down to the fact that after the Hollywood 2012 film came out, there's been a lot of panic, of course, because it's a total catastrophe film. And so the media has been going to the academics, the Mayanists, the archaeoastronomers, and asking them, is it true? Is the world going to end in 2012 according to the Maya? Well, they have only one choice. Whatever they say, the media just want one headline, and that is the ancient prophecies say the world will end in 2012, or something to that effect. So basically, the academics don't have any choice. If they want to keep their jobs and their funding, they've got to rubbish the whole subject. And so I'm going to go through, introduce you to a few of these characters and what they've said very briefly, and then what's come out of what they've said, and the most recent developments where Sven Gronemeyer, who's the world expert on Tortuguero, where this monument was found, he's come out with a new updated translation of it, which is not yet published. That's why we were worried about the copyright. But I've kind of squidged it down a bit. So, this is Dr. E.C. Krupp, the noted archaeoastronomer, and for some time he's been criticising John Major Jenkins's galactic alignment theory. Now, for those of you that don't know what galactic alignment theory is, Jenkins has done a lot of work trying to decipher why the Maya ended their long count calendar, their 13 Bacton cycle, in 2012. And it's because, according to all the masses of evidence that Jenkins has found, it's because between 1980 and 2016, the sun on the winter solstice crosses the galactic equator. And 21st December 2012, when the calendar reaches its termination point and turns over, that is the point when the sun on the winter solstice will be on the galactic equator. But it takes 36 years for it to cross the galactic equator. So various people have put up arguments like, oh, if it's a 36-year process, why didn't the Maya sort of pinpoint the exact middle point in 1998, or did they make a 13-year mistake? Well, that's another conversation. I don't think they made a mistake. I think they were using it as a celestial clock. Their endpoint pinpoints the significant time during that window area, but I won't go into that argument now. Anyway, this Krupp has, of course, mentioned that point, and he also says that, well, he says exactly what Avani says, which I'll tell you in a moment, but basically they are making these statements not by reading Jenkins's books, not even by reading the whole article, just by going to Google and reading the little summary. And so they've got a second-hand, and not even on the original Jenkins site, they're going to second-hand information that's been compressed. So they're not really qualified, although they are highly qualified professionally, they're not qualified to comment on this really because they haven't read it properly, and I'll give you an example of that. Anyway, Jenkins's response to what Krupp has said is, this is an example of the misleading know-it-all proclamations of come-lately scholars. And if you want to read more of that kind of thing, it's on this link here. So we go on to David Friedel. That's him there next to a statue of Lord Pakal. And Friedel has basically accused me and Jenkins and people of our ilk of being charlatans profiteering from the gullible public. And he's sent out he got one of his students to produce a presentation like this done on PowerPoint. And we've got a copy of that, and I'll show you one of the slides from that presentation. He's showing my book on the left and Jenkins's book on the right, with Lawrence Joseph's Total Catastrophe book in the middle. And yes, the latest craze, Doomsday 2012, on December 21st, 2012, the Earth will be destroyed, enter intergalactic alignment, enter the Age of Aquarius, be recreated, or simply cease to exist, depending on which New Age author you ask. Now, Jenkins commented to me that this is as ridiculous as if we had noted that Friedel has a beard and put him in a class of people with beards like this. That just shows the kind of absurdity we're dealing with. What these people are doing, as I just explained, they're omitting essential details and then criticising the Précide version, which is inaccurate. Jenkins has described this as, if he said, for example, crab apples are bitter, that would not be too outrageous a statement. But then if someone came along and said, Jenkins says apples are bitter, well, that's completely different. You miss out the key word and it changes the meaning of the whole thing. You can say Jenkins is a charlatan because he says apples are bitter, and that's plainly not true. See, now you want to know more about that? There's the link. It's Jenkins's Update 2012 site. So we go on to Anthony Avani. That's the book he's written recently, The End of Time 2012. Now, he's one of two Mayanists who've basically tried to write these criticisms of this angle that we're all looking at 2012 from, and he's written it into a book. And he's also done a talk in which he made the quote, which is virtually word for word what's written in the book. And basically, on my website, there's a page about 2012 products. I don't make any money from any of these things on my website. I was very careful not to do that, so I wouldn't be accused of being a charlatan profiteering from the public. But I have got this page listing other people's 2012 products. You click on it, you go straight to the product, and there's some quite funny ones that I included for a laugh. And he says, Stray, for sale on his website are 2012 wall clocks, underpants and thongs. See? And then the audience give a big laugh. And it's as if he's making a joke and I'm really serious about selling this underwear with the 4 hour on it. So anyway, there he is pointing in the direction of my web logo here. And I just note that that little symbol there, we just mentioned that later on, it's known as the Hunab-Ku symbol. Right, thirdly, David Stewart, arguably the world's leading epigrapher. Well, I think the other epicureans would probably argue with that, but yeah, he's a fascinating child prodigy. If you look at Michael Coe's film Breaking the Mayan Code, you can see film of him about 12 years old, being as advanced in decoding Mayan glyphs as the professional academics. Anyway, he's a lot older than 12 now. And he says that the apocalypse meme originates with New Age hacks. That is actually not true, because in 1966, Michael Coe, one of the grandfathers of modern academic Mayanism, oh no, we can't call it Mayanism, I'll explain that in a minute, but he basically said in that book that the Mayan calendar would end on, I think it was the 24th of December 2011, and that the Maya thought it would be the end of the world. Now, when the new edition came out, he changed it to 2013, because in both instances he now admits he made an error, and the most recent editions of it state 2012. So they're not perfect, these academics, and he is the originator, the first person that said the Maya said the world would end around that time. So they like to repeat these things to make out it's all our fault, but it isn't. And but this is he did us all a big favour in 2006 when he translated this portion of that Tortuguero monument I mentioned, and he said the significant part of it, which is just here, the 13th Bactum will be finished on 4 Ahau, the 3rd of Kankin, that's 3 Maya calendars cross-referencing, 21st of December 2012. Something will occur which they couldn't decide on. It will be the descent, possibly, of the 9 support gods, that's the Bolon Yokti gods, and then they couldn't translate the last glyph because you can see it's chipped off. Anyway, that's the thing that has changed recently. Stephen Houston, another leading epigrapher, he says about this monument fairly recently, it has nothing to do with prophecy or the supposed dread events that await us in AD 2012. About that, the Maya are notably silent or, truth be told, a bit boring. Now, this is actually something that doesn't agree with the latest research, and yet the academics like this idea of making it all sound a bit boring. I must quickly replace that man's photograph, because he's John Carlson. This is also John Carlson, actually, but it's not actually the same John Carlson, but they did... John Carlson, I advertised on my Facebook that he did a talk recently in America, and a friend of Jenkins actually went to the talk, recorded the talk, and then he sent me a copy of the talk, and I did a review of it on my website, and then the university that put the talk on emailed me and said, can you take that photograph off, because we own the copyright to that photograph, and can you take the review off, because we promised the speaker, Carlson, we wouldn't have anybody filming it. But they didn't say that to the audience, you see, or recording it in any way. So I wrote back and said, well, okay, here's a bit on your website that says that I can use the photograph, but by politeness, I replaced it on the website with that one. But I said, I'm not taking the review off because you didn't warn the audience. You know, I suggest that this is a wake-up call for you to improve your security and tell people if you don't want them recording it, tell the audience that. You know. Like Avni, Carlson, during this talk, claimed that the Maya couldn't have predicted galactic alignment because they could not have known we live in a galaxy because they didn't have telescopes. They only had visual astronomy. But actually, Jenkins never claimed that they knew we lived in a galaxy. The whole thing is explained in Maya mythology, mythologically, where you have the sun god emerging from Xibalba B, which is the dark road to the underworld. They don't speak of it in terms of galaxies. And then Carlson goes on to say that Jenkins and I haven't done our homework because we don't know about the year drift formula. Well, it's him who hasn't done his homework, because Jenkins has got a section on it. In fact, he mentioned it twice in Maya Cosmogenesis, and I have mentioned it in the back of my little calendar book as well. And it's defined quite clearly there. It's a way in which the Maya could track the solar year by knowing exactly how many halves it took for the whole thing to come around in a circle again. So yes, there's the review, diagnosis2012.co.uk/Carlson with a capital C, .html if you want to read my terribly frank review of what he said, because apparently when Jenkins's book came out, he offered Carlson a copy, but during this thing which we heard, no wonder he didn't want anyone to record it, someone in the audience asked him, have you actually read Jenkins's books? He said, oh yes. But Jenkins, when the book came out, offered Carlson a copy and he refused to accept it. And it's quite obvious from the various things he said that he hadn't read it. So we go on to Mark Van Stone. Now, yes, he's written this book recently. It's about $49, I think. It's quite expensive, but it's very nicely produced, and it's a really informative book, and it is a very good, interesting book about this whole subject, but it's all twisted around a bit to try and, the whole point of it is to try and diffuse this 2012 topic. And he makes a few little things that I don't agree with in there. He goes off the topic hugely, although it's really interesting. You get the impression that there's this huge tome of evidence about 2012 being rubbish, but in fact most of it doesn't actually connect to 2012. But it is interesting nonetheless if you're interested in the Maya. He does trivialise the creation monuments, which are the ones that the beginning of this cycle started in 3114 BC, and there's about 6 or 7, no, a few more than that now. There may be about 12 altogether if you include the little vases and things that mention the beginning point in 3114 BC. Well, he kind of trivialises those, but he ends up quoting Houston's "It's all a bit boring" about the monument, Monument 6. He does include some interesting correspondence about it between the Mayanists, because in order to help diffuse the situation, they've all suddenly got interested in retranslating Monument 6 to make it even more boring than they really did before. So this is John Hoops. Now he's quite well known because he's actually the moderator of Year 2012 Discussion Group, which is one of the biggest discussion groups on the net on this subject. And he has sort of, I've appreciated some of the things he said because he's actually poured some light onto some subjects where people would go off into fluffy bunny land. But he's actually kept people to the facts sometimes, and it does, keep things sane sometimes, but also he has got an agenda. Now, he started up a Wikipedia page called Mayanism. This is what it says. Mayanism is a term used to refer to non-codified eclectic collection of New Age beliefs, influenced in part by pre-Columbian Mayan mythology and some folk beliefs of the modern Maya peoples. Adherents of this belief system are not to be confused with Mayanists, whose scholars who research the historical Maya civilization. Now, I think this guy is a professor, and I think he hasn't admitted that he's getting funding. I think he's being funded because I've run a discussion group, and it takes up a huge amount of your time, and he's running a massive discussion group. You have to read and edit everything. So I think he's being funded for this, but he has confessed to me that his main interest in the year 2012, and why he became moderator, is because he's interested, as an anthropologist, he's interested in self-fulfilling prophecies, and he thinks that all the interest in the year 2012 will create an event, which the people will then say, told you so, something was going to happen in 2012, you see. And so he'll be able to come up with all the research he's done. But one interesting thing he did come up with was when, on the discussion group, someone said, where did the Hunab Ku symbol come from? Which most people think it's a Maya symbol for the center of the galaxy and the Yucatec god Hunab Ku. But in fact, it comes, well, by a long route. I won't bore you with how Jenkins had to clear his garage out to find it out, but you can just read here. It comes from a codex, which is actually an Aztec codex called Codex Magliabechiano. Here it says something about the cloak of the devil. And it's actually a cloak design originally, and this one here it says Manca de agua e araña. So it's a cloak of spider water, but Hoop says that's been mistranslated, and it actually should be, because that's the Spanish translation from the Nahuatl, and it should be Festival of the Lip Plugs. So it's actually a design of a cloak for an Aztec festival called Festival of the Lip Plugs. It's got nothing to do with the Maya, nothing to do with the center of the galaxy, and nothing to do with Hunab Ku, unfortunately, because it's the logo for my website. But you know, kudos to the man for finding out the truth, but really, we don't really have a replacement for it at the moment, so we may as well all continue using it for that purpose, but there's nothing wrong with knowing the truth. Anyway, going on to the Tortuguero monument that's caused all this controversy. It was completed in 510 AD. It was erected in 669 AD. The site was discovered in 1915. The study was first published in German in 1978. It was destroyed by a cement factory in 1981. The army then blew to bits what was left of it for target practice. So there's absolutely nothing left of it now, but some little bits of this monument are scattered around. That piece there is in a museum in New York. That piece and those 3 pieces are in the museum at Villa Hermosa, but it's shut at the moment, so you can't look at it. And those 2 pieces are in the hands of a private collector, and nobody knows who it is. But they have got some old photographs of it. So how boring is it? Well, Sven Gronemeyer in 2006 wrote the first English work on this, translated into English. He is German. And before I got hold of the English copy, I got a copy of the German version, and I used several online translators and my next-door neighbour to help me translate it into English. And this is my version of the translation of the German transliteration. 7 days and 7 weenials and 0 tuns and 8 katuns previously. Don't worry about those, they're just time cycles. On 8 Chuen 9 Mac, that's a Mayan date, it was completed for rebirthing the Pibna of Akalkuk. In other words, this monument was set up to commemorate a Pibna, which one of the other epigraphers has told us is a becoming ripe house or an underground house. And it was especially for Akalkuk. It was 2 days, 9 weenials, 3 tuns, 8 katuns, and 3 baktons before the 13th bakton is completed on 4 ahau, 3 kankin. Then it will happen. Darkness and Bolon Yokti will descend to but we don't know quite what. So that is my version of what we heard before from Stuart. But really, to be a proper English translation, it has to read properly with no gaps and things. So you would say, basically, this precious stone was set up in the shrine portal 158 years and 30 days after the 7th of December 510 AD, when Akalkuk's rebirthing shrine was completed. This was 1,502 years and 14 days before the end of the current era on December 21st, 2012. Then it will happen. Darkness and the descent of the 9 underworld gods to the... We still can't really complete it there. But it's a little bit more sense, because the problem is with these epigraphers, they're not linguists. They're experts on glyph translation, so they translate each glyph, but they're not bothered whether it actually makes any sense or not. So that's where linguists come in and have to translate the transliteration into some sort of sensible statement. Oh, nascent becoming, by the way, is the way I translated rebirthing. That was how the German word translated into English, so I put that as rebirthing. Anyway, just recently, Sven Gronemeyer here has put out a new article. Well, he hasn't put it out yet, actually. I got hold of it, but it's not actually been published yet. Anyway, he's redrawn the this section of Tortuguero Monument 6, and he's already given permission to use that. So the new drawing is hardly different at all, but you notice that glyph there, which was translated as darkness by some people. It's slightly different now because they've got a better photograph. And this glyph here, very tiny little differences, but they've got more information on what it might be, and there's something here that they've decided means something else. So this effort has involved a lot of epigraphers. Mainly Barb MacLeod, Sven Gronemeyer, Elizabeth Wagner, Christian Prager. You can see 1 or 2 of the emails in that book by him, Mark Stone, if you want to spend that amount of money on it. But all these other people were involved they were on the mailing list, so all these people know about it. Now, some of these people are actually kind of double agents because they've been working with John Major Jenkins to actually find some very interesting things encoded on here, as I'll tell you about. So anyway, Mark Van Stone came up with, in his book, he was the first person to give us a new translation, having been party to these emails, and he put it out as this: will have been completed the 13th Bacton, will happen the witnessing attending of the display of Bologna in the great impersonation envelopment in costume and regalia. So that is pretty boring, you have to agree. He's really done a good job on that. But in Sven's updated article, it's called What Could Happen in 2012, the Reanalysis of Tortuguero Monument 6. And he starts off, surprisingly, by trying to give the old debunk about 2012 is not the end of the era anyway, because it didn't have 13 Bacton cycles, it had 20 Bacton cycles, and that's based on one inscription from Palenque, in which Lord Pakal was trying to do exactly what the King of Tortuguero had done and connect himself to a future event, thereby improving his status. Except he outdid the King of Tortuguero, who connected himself to 2012, the end of the 13 Bacton cycle. I mean, of course, Sven didn't explain all this, but the King of Lord Pakal, King of Palenque, connected himself to the end of the Picton, the 20 Bacton cycle. So now they've basically dug up an old argument that's been going on for, well, since 1897. I'm just writing a piece on that at the moment, which will hopefully settle it once and for all, because these people don't read the old material anymore. After Thompson died, Thompson was the world expert on calendars. He knew all this. They really haven't dug that deeply into it. Anyway, after that, Sven goes on and says that these are the translations of those glyphs. Instead of darkness, we've got see or a seeing. Instead of just Bolognotti will descend, we've got Bolognotti holds. Instead of that last glyph meaning nothing, it now means in great encircling or in a great encircling. So Sven puts that together thus: it will be completed in the 13th Bacton, it's 4 how 3 cankin, and that will happen a seeing. He Bolognotti coup holds or shows in a great encircling. Slightly better than Van Stone, but yes, then Sven actually says, oh, Houston was right, it is a bit boring. That's beginning to sound a little bit like a conspiracy. They are conspiring to make it boring. But in the course of Sven's new article, these two pieces of paper, which I've extracted the English, because there's also lots of Spanish on here as well, these are all the times that those words that they've translated, as we've just given, have been translated differently for other purposes, because there's such a variation in depending on where you are in Maya land and the variations in language and etc., that it actually gives a lot of leeway for different translations. So instead of he shows or demonstrates it, or he shows, just he shows it, these are the alternatives. He demonstrates it, open-handed, reveal, show, proclaim wedding bands, show, display, offer, be, proclaim the wedding bands, offer, self, woman, worker, show or display, showing, offering, menacing. And there's loads of ones for the other one, including dilute, dissolve, prepare, coffee, avoid, evade, detour, dissolve, etc. Lots of ones about encircling, roundabout, procession, seated in a circle, fence around a large area, walking in circles, going circles, spinning round, a wedding godfather, rituals, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, you go through that lot, and you can come up with some really interesting variations. Instead of it will happen a seeing, you could have there will be a revelation, or there will be an apparition, or and people's eyes will be opened, or and there will be mass visions, and perceptions will pierce the veil. Instead of the other part, which is Bolognotti holds or shows in a great encircling, you could have Bolognotti will be imprisoned or sealed in the great enclosure, will make the coffee. it's there. Bolognotti will reveal a huge crop circle. Bolognotti will be proclaimed as godfather. Bolognotti will start a great whirling. Or Bolognotti will offer a great prayer. Even Bolognotti will proclaim the great wedding or the spiritual wedding, perhaps. So putting it together, you can have things like, at the completion of the 13th Bacton on 4 how 3 cankin, there will be a mass hallucination as the deity Nine Dog Tree reveals the circle of tutelary gods. Or, at the completion of the 13th Bacton on 4 how 3 cankin, there will be a mass enlightenment when the 9-footed god inaugurates the spiritual wedding. Or, at the completion of the 13th Bacton on 4 how 3 cankin, the veil will dissolve when the 9-fold god encircles the ecliptic. Or, at the completion of the 13th Bacton on 4 how 3 cankin, there will be the apocalypse, which is the revelation or seeing in That's where it comes from. When the 9 gods of the underworld, as Gronomai and Prager have both written articles, that Bol and Yokti is the same as the 9 gods of the underworld, put everything in order. Much, much more interesting, eh? And another point is Dennis Tedlock's book that's just come out shows these little steps that are being made, just like Avni in his interviews about Jenkins completely dissed him, but then a few months later they start to accept certain little things, and where they previously said there's no possibility they could have known about the winter solstice, now he's saying there was an intentionality behind the winter solstice endpoint. So they're very, very slowly beginning to accept Jenkins's galactic alignment, but they're not giving him any credit, and that's exactly what Jenkins said would happen. So basically, he talks about references to the Dark Rift in the creation monuments, but he doesn't mention the galactic alignment at all, or Jenkins. Now, on to Jenkins's new discoveries. As I said, he's been working with Grove from Cloud and come up with some very interesting material here. And these represent all the dates encoded on the whole of that cross-shaped monument. And as you can see, it involves many places. The Dark Rift is involved in these conjunctions and alignments that coincide with these dates, which they've worked out with astronomical software. And these are particularly interesting. Balama Hau, that's the king of Tortuguero, was born when the sun was in the Dark Rift. The Pibna, the sacred chamber for which this was erected to commemorate, when that was erected when the sun was in the Dark Rift. Winter solstice 2012, the sun will be in the Dark Rift. There's a direct connection between these. And even the position where they are on here will seem to make sense. And another interesting one, Balama Hau's death was actually when Jupiter was in the Dark Rift, as if they'd actually said, okay, Jupiter's in the Dark Rift, it's time to go now. So maybe he sacrificed in order to keep that connection. Now, this is another breaking news thing. In December last year, Eric Boot, who's one of those Mayanists we mentioned, wrote an article mentioning this, which was actually drawn in 1984. It comes from Comilcauco, which is mentioned in the monument. It's one of the places that Tortuguero conquered. And he translated it as, "For a how 3 Kankin arrives, it will be completed." Pretty controversial because everybody had been saying for years there's nothing in the inscriptions about 2012. Then when they had to admit it, they were going, yeah, but there's only one inscription about 2012. Then it looked like there's another one. And the interesting thing about this is apparently Malinke or sub-Saharan script from Africa, giving us a controversial link between the Olmecs and the Africans. And Mark Zender, though, in July, just this month, has said, no, it's wrong, because that should be 4 How 3 Zul, a completely different date. He arrives at Zukak, which is a place, so it's actually totally irrelevant, according to Mark Zender. That, well, I don't think that they would lie about that, but, you know, they do like to twist things sometimes. Anyway, on to the original material. How are we doing for time?
25 minutes.
Oh, good. Drink. Right, so basically, once we've established that the only inscription there is about 2012 says that the 9 gods, originally we thought it would be they would descend in darkness, but now it could mean any of those things that I've said, some revelation or something being revealed, and then, you know, they'll be doing something circular. Who are they? You know, let's throw some more light on it. Well, what is a Pibna, first of all? A Pibna, usually translated Tuj Chitin or Kitin Kun, steam bath, Temazcal, that's the Aztec word for it. They are variously steam rooms or ovens, used a bit like a sauna. And because the bit that the other translation given to us by Stuart, as I mentioned earlier, said that the Pibna was a becoming ripe house or an underground house or shrine. So that seems to fit in. It's not just a steam bath, but it seems to fit in with some things we'll be looking at in a minute, which is basically about Hopi Kivas. Now, while I remember here, this is the web address of the article that I've written on Hancock's website. But basically, if you don't want to write that down, it just says go to Graham Hancock and go to articles and then look for Tortuguero Unraveled article if you want to know more about this and hear the whole story. So there have been pibnas at Chichen Itza. They are ritual purification ceremonies that went on inside them, according to the academics, in which healing, revitalization, cleansing, and meetings took place. The Aztec temazcals usually were dug into the ground about 5 feet, but they used direct fire rather than hot rocks like a sauna. The Native Americans in California used this exact same method. And the design and alignment is very similar to a Hopi Kiva, except that the entrance wasn't in the roof. As you can see in these pictures here, it was in the side of the building, and the steam is coming out at the back there. So today's kivas are mainly a square and above the ground, but you still go into them from the roof. But originally, as you can see in this Anasazi kiva, they were circular and mostly under the ground. So today's temazcals are also above the ground, but they are quite often circular. And the Hopi actually say that they think they are related to the Maya. They say that the Maya are renegade Hopi clans that didn't finish their migrations. And the academics would agree that there is probably a connection via the Anasazi. But if you look at the central part of one of these ruined pibnas, you find it's very much like the hearth in the center of a Hopi Kiva. Well, the Kachina beliefs, which the ceremonial use of the Kivas are centered around Kachina spirits, but the Kivas actually date from much earlier than that whole concept. So it seems that reasonable to assume that their function has changed or was adapted, taking us back to the connection with the Maya. And some clues. Sweat lodges and kivas are both seen as symbolic wombs of the Earth Mother, and some tribes have sweat lodge creation myths. And in the Hopi Kiva, some of those ceremonies reenact creation myths, and we'll go into that in a minute. But if you go on holiday to Mexico, you quite often get a trip into a temazcal as part of the deal. And the people that have done it have said they feel and experience the spirit bodies, they acknowledge the 4 elements, they experience rebirth and the death of parts of the ego that no longer serve growth, and they're used for pregnancy and birth. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you can be gently beaten with corn husks soaked in tea. Well, the kiva, as I've mentioned before, they use these for these ceremonies, and one very interesting one in November every year when it's called Wuwuchim ceremony. That's a sort of depiction of what's going on down there. The shaman comes down the ladder at the height of the ceremony when the Pleiades are overhead at midnight, directly connecting it to the Toltec method of measuring precession, and thereby connecting it to the Maya and their calendar system. And he says, I am the beginning and the end. And he takes off his mask and his clothes. Everyone else takes all their clothes off and their masks, and they all rush up the ladder to try and get out before the world ends. Now, it's seen as a rebirth process because the ladder is known as the umbilicus. The little hole in the floor, which you can see there, is called the sipapu. That represents the ascent from the second world into the third world. The inside of the kiva is like a uterus representing the third world, from which they're born into the current outside world, the fourth world. And the whole thing is a rebirth, re-going through their birth process, and then they're all washed naked and sweating in 9 bowls of yucca suds. Notice the number 9 starting to crop up here. And the whole thing is seen as a birth process, as I said, and symbolized with the labyrinth symbol, which is the same as the Cretan labyrinth symbol, and they call it the mother and child symbol. So this concept that I was talking about yesterday of birth, and that 2012 being a birth, so resonates very well with that. And the number 9, there are 9 ceremonies that are done in the kivas every year. They are about birth, seed germination, planting and sprouting for the first 3, and the next 3 are growth, maturing, irrigation and planting, and fruition. And then the third set are fertility, planting, harvesting, flirtation and food gifts, and conception and gifts. Well, the ones with the asterisk, there, and there, also include something about this rebirth at the end of the world. Now, by the end of the world, I mean the end of the fourth world and the start of the fifth world, because the Hopi thought there were a set of 7 worlds, and we're in the fourth world, approaching this transition, which they call an emergence, and then we'll go into the fifth world. So each of these includes something about that idea. One in each of the set of 3. But that's the one we were just talking about. The whole of that Wuwuchim ceremony is about this rebirth at the end of an era. So as you can see, that it seems to be about plants mainly, but it's also about humanity and flirtation and food. It brings in human gestation here, and it seems to be about plant gestation. The reason for that connection is because the maize, which, like the Maya, is their staple diet, in some places has a 260-day gestation between planting and harvesting. At 260 days, just the same as there are 9 months gestation for the human. In the Maya system, when the woman has a period, there are 260 days before the baby's due. So there's a direct connection between the maize and people. So these ceremonies that they hold in there work on 3 levels: seed germination, crop fertility rituals, human fertility and birth rituals, initiation, mystery plays, and rebirth rituals and reruns as a preparation for emergence to the next world or sun. Well, Mayan sun, world for the Hopi. But what I'm saying is, there's reason to suspect that some of these beliefs and ideas that the Hopi have preserved were actually significant for the Maya in the original use of the Pibna, for which Tortuguero Monument 6 was erected to commemorate it. So the second question is, who is this Bolonyoktiku? Well, also known as the God of 9 strides, numerous strides, 9 steps, 9-dog tree, 9-footed god, jaguar foot tree. This is some of the examples of how we have so much choice in these translations. These are some of the glyphs that have been used for Bolonyokti. Gods of conflict, warfare, dangerous transition times, social unrest, eclipses, natural disasters, and earthquakes. They appear at the end of Bactans, and they also appeared when the Spanish arrived. They assisted at the creation of the current world and will be present at the next creation, which is 2012, because 3114 BC was the creation. When it reaches 13 Bactans, then it turns over and goes on to the next time that it turns over at 13 Bactans, which is 2012. So the archaeologists tell us that there are 3 of these structures at Palenque, but these they do vary somewhat, these pibnas in the archaeological sites, but these Temple of the Cross, Temple of the Foliated Cross, and Temple of the Sun at Palenque are said to be pibnas in the glyphs which accompany the friezes that are inside at the back of these temples here. And they were seen, if you read what it says in the glyphs, they were seen as entrances to the underworld. Xibalba B, they were like a ground version of the Dark Rift where the alignment is happening in 2012. And that Xibalba B entrance to the underworld was where the shamans used to travel to and then bring back all the knowledge. And on these things, it shows God El, who is the Lord of the underworld, the Bolon Zakab, also known as G2 or Kawil. Bolon actually means 9. And Jaguar God is shown on this one. Now, Jaguar is a Maya pun for number 9 because Balan is Jaguar. Balan is Jaguar and Bolon is 9. So they were obviously using that as a pun, according to the academics. And God El, as you'll see, also has a connection with the number 9. So there's evidence they were using these places for rites of passage, just like the Hopi used their kiva. This is the Temple of the Cross. And it says in the text that this was, at the beginning of creation, the maize god sprouted here, and that coming-of-age rites were held here. At age 13, sort of puberty rites, the king was tied into octiship, receiving Bolonyokti. This is actually Lord Pakal's son, who these were built by and for. At age 18, he took the Kawil scepter. So there's two number 9s there, the Kawil and the Bolonyokti there. And he's wearing a 9-knotted costume in, well, they say it's 9 anyway in the text. And if we go on to the next of those, the Temple of the Foliated Cross, the world tree is seen here as a maize plant, and this was used for the passage rites of Can Balam, that's Pakal's son, his accession to the throne. And interestingly, you can see that the maize plant has little human heads here, here, and here, again showing this connection between maize gestation and human gestation. But it shows that there's this connection with human passage rites and plant passage rites, like in the Hopi Kiva. In the Temple of the Sun, it says in the text that the king was training up to become a shaman and go into the underworld via the shrine entrances, which became Xibalba B, the entrance to the underworld. And as I said, jaguar is a pun for the number 9 as well. So, God El, the chief of the underworld, Grof, one of those Mayanists we mentioned, has written an essay last year showing that there's evidence that God El is Bolonyokti as well. There's 9 little footprints here. This thing is known as the skeletal centipede, which is the white road of the Milky Way, and there's 9 footsteps going up it. So Bolonyokti, the 9-footed god, he says, is probably the same as God El, the Lord of the Underworld, who is here wearing a jaguar pelt, which has also got this number 9 connection. Right. So another article by Gronemeyer in 2006, you can find all these on the Wayeb notes, by the way, W-A-Y-E-B, all these academic articles I'm mentioning. It's all online. He wrote this article saying that these 9 glyphs, these 9 underworld gods, are actually growth stages, 9 growth stages in the life cycle of the maize plant. And these are calendrical gods. There's one that rules every 24 hours. And on the 21st December 2012, this one will be ruling Night Lord 9. And in fact, if you various versions of that, you can see that the thing he's got on his head is ripe maize, because it represents the completion of the growth process. And that's why the 4 Ahau is the end of the calendar and not 13 Ahau, as Carl Kalleman has suggested, because it represents the completion of the growth cycle of the maize and humanity. The 9 growth cycles are introducing, planting the seed, first flowering, young ears of corn wrapped in protective silks, ripening, rebirth, ripe ear, and they go again into 3, like in the Hopi ceremonies. This is seen as 3 groups of 3. And this is from an Aztec codex showing the maize plant as a little human with representing 3 of these steps in this same process. So again, this supports this idea that the Maya used that Pibna as a rite for rites of passage. So what it all adds up to is that Tortuguero Pibna, for which this Monument 6 was erected, is used for the ripening of seeds and humans, a rebirthing, an individual version of the mass rebirth that will happen at the next creation in 2012. So, what does that mean for us? Well, these 9 gods, if we go back to the Popol Vuh myth, you'll find that this is a central thing around which the Maya based all their calendars and everything. And it talks about 2 gods, the 1 Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu, who descended into the underworld to play a game of ball with the Lords of Death. The Lords of Death summoned them because they didn't like the noise they were making on their roof, basically. And so they said, we'll stop their little ball game, we'll have a game with them. And they basically won the game, they tricked the Hunahpus, and they beheaded them and hung their heads in the calabash tree. That's why the severed head represents the sun, because these are the sun gods. Anyway, their sons, or the sons of 1 Hunahpu, later descend into the underworld to avenge their father's death and resurrect the sun god. But during that process, they have to go through the 6 houses of Xibalba, which are the Bat House, the Razor House, the Dark House, the Jaguar House, the Fire House, the Cold House. They are basically facing their own fears. And they end up, unlike their fathers, they end up not being tricked. They beat them in the ball game. They end up tricking the Lords of Death into killing themselves. But during the process, they face up to all their shadow material, all that buried stuff. All these things represent the buried stuff within, which we all have to face up to. Thanks. And at the end of the process, they achieved rebirth and immortality. Now, I think this has got a direct meaning for us today. Because in some versions, in the Popal Vuh, there are 12 lords and 6 houses in the underworld, but in other sources, such as the 9 lords of the underworld, and in the Aztec sources, where the 9 night lords are the same as the 9 lords of the 9 levels of the underworld. Basically, we're looking at the same thing here, but that's a different number as opposed to 9. They've got it in 6 here. And it turns out that this is represented in quite a few other cultures across the world. And this is where I'm really compressing things here, but in times gone past, we have here Dante's Inferno, a diagram from that, in which he shows that there are 9 levels to the underworld, there are 9 levels to purgatory, and there are 9 levels to heaven. And then once you get beyond heaven, there are 9 choirs of angels, and there's about 5 sets of 9 altogether. And that bottom one, you can't see it very well there, but we actually have had a crop circle like that. That's Kircher's, I think that's Kircher's design for the cosmos, where you have a 9-level cosmos again. And more familiar will be the Yggdrasil, the Norse world tree. And all across the world, shamans travel up and down a tree from the middle section, which one of the pictures has failed to come out. Oh, there it is. In the Maya cosmology, you have a tree here, and the shamans travel up and down the tree, and the Earth's in the middle. They travel up to the overworld and down to the underworld. Well, they had 13 heavens and 9 hells, so-called, or 9 levels to the underworld and 13 levels to the sky. In the Norse version, there are 3 realms also, but they're split into 9 sub-realms. And, of course, you've got a connection in the Norse mythology with Ragnarok, the end of time, and Tolkien took his mythology directly from the Norse ideas, and the 9 Nazgul are the dead kings or immortals in the realm of shadows. And at the end, the whole of the Lord of the Rings was set at the end of the Third Age, when there's a battle of good between evil, which happens at the end of each of these ages. And then the Fourth Age starts with the passing of the ring. So, and this goes into lots of modern mythology and film scripts as well, but I haven't got time for all that. Now, if you look at the Masonic, the 13th degree of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, it's called the Arch of Enoch. Enoch was 365, giving us this calendrical clue as there are 365 days to the year. Enoch, according to this myth, or this rite which is still performed, was told to build 9 vaults in a vertical sequence. The Temple of Solomon was built variously either right next to it or on top of it. And then the 9 elect, which were the 9 Jewish temple priests, were in charge of the Temple of Solomon. But when Solomon's builders found these vaults that Enoch had dug, he incorporated a similar design beneath the Temple of Solomon. But when Enoch was told by God to build these vaults, he was told to build them vertically, one below the other, and in the bottom vault, he was to leave a jewel-studded golden triangle inscribed with the name of God. Now, I just found that today on the internet. That is an actual Masonic piece of jewelry which commemorates that act, where they're actually taking the slab off to go down the 9 vaults there, and that's the golden triangle with the name of God inscribed on it. There were 2 pillars that marked the position of these vaults left by Enoch, one silver and one brass. I think one was, well, they're basically with brass and stone. I think they were built to survive the flood, because Enoch's grandson was Noah. So he was getting some early instructions on surviving earth changes there. Anyway, the 9 Templar priests who were descended from the 9 elect spent 9 years exploring the 9 vaults. And then, of course, they then took the Ark of the Covenant, so it said, and put it either in Rosslyn, which Knight and Lomas thinks is a replica of the temple and also has 9 vaults, or some say at Oak Island. And at Oak Island there are 9 log layers which they excavated down before the booby trap was activated and flooded it all. So this is only a fraction of these 9 connections. If you look on that essay, you'll see how this comes up everywhere. Now, locally, we have the mythology about Avalon. And in the Grail legend, Perceval was empowered by the 9 witches of Gloucester. There are 9 sisters who cool the cauldron of Anwin in the Welsh version. King Arthur entered the underworld of Avalon to steal the cauldron. And when he died, Morgan and her 8 sisters, who were living in Avalon, healed Arthur, except, some people think that he actually didn't survive that healing and he was buried in the abbey because they found his grave there. That's another story that we could argue over. There is an Irish sisterhood of 9 sisters, and there's Morgan Le Fay and her 9 sisters. That's her name. Their names there. But what they say about Morgan is that she makes us face our inadequacies and illusions. Again, giving us this idea of rites of, this whole rites of passage connection with 2012. This is what we may be facing our fears and illusions and our inadequacies. And in the Taoist belief system, you have Taoist alchemy. And there's this little dance that they do, which actually encodes hexagram 63. Not hexagram 64, because hexagram 63 is, although it's not the last numerically, it is the last because it's called climax and after equilibrium achieved. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that is that's the code word for 2012. The little code saying there. The 9 cauldrons of transformation in which are brewed 9 ingredients for the elixir of immortality, the 9 numinous jewels. Now, this is I've gone and forgotten his name now. It's in the essay anyway. He says that this is encoding this alchemical process which goes on inside our own brain. That we have 9 cranial palaces governed by these stars, the 9 stars, 7 visible and 4 and 2 hidden of Ursa Major. A sacred pregnancy occurs, the nurture of an embryonic immortal being within. And it almost sort of brings us back to the god of 9 steps, Bolon Yokti. Now, this again is suggesting that there is this internal alchemical process connected up with this transition point, in which we actually germinate some form of vehicle that helps us to transition to the next level. And there's an interesting correspondence with the Eye of Horus there, because the Eye of Horus, each part of it was used as a fraction for measure of grain and of time. If you add the fractions up, you get 63 64ths, and that's what this hexagram is, 63rd out of the 64. So bringing it all together, it's about the healing and revealing of the God self. So in the extended version of this, you would have gone through a lot more to actually convince you of these, but basically all the connections from all across the world about the number 9 bring us to the conclusion that there are 3 basic mythologies that we can connect up with this transition. Healing the wounded king, which means descent to the underworld of 9 levels, confrontation with inner violence, rage and fear. We get to the deepest level and regain the divine connection, and then we have healing and rejuvenation. On the next version, we have an ascent to the 9th heaven. Consciousness rises through 9 spheres. Shiva and Shakti unite. Goddess returns. Whole mind integration of right and left brain. And the third one is the cyclic return of the gods. There's a definite 9 connection to precession. All the precessional numbers add up to 9. And there's these all the stone circles in Cornwall are called the Nine Maidens, for example. There's a connection with goddess and underworld everywhere. Cyclic Return of the Gods, governed by precession, circa 2012, our inner cauldrons will be activated. So yeah, I've only got a little bit. How many minutes? No time. Right. Well, I timed it all right then. So basically, these are Alex Gray's pictures that give us an idea of what we're talking about. That's from my book that brings together a lot of these ideas, and I hadn't consciously even realised about all of them. You know, you've got the hexagram 63 there as well. So,
got to end though, Geoff.
Oh, well, I'm just going to read this last statement, if you don't mind, before in 2012, it'll be a confrontation with our shadows at a time of social and environmental upheaval. This is part of a spiritual Kundalini process. That should result in an integration of sub-personalities into an enlightened state, allowing expanded perception and the generation of a plasma body. So that sort of ties up the whole thing, really. And that should have actually come up while I was saying that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Geoff Stray. A man who knows his stuff. Fantastic stuff. Thank you very much. And
Thanks.
I doubtless you'll be around, so if you want to have a chat with Geoff, do. And Geoff's